We're on the top of Daf Dalid Omid Aleph, and the Mishnah says, "V'elu shechayovim b'kalbon." So we're going to begin with a new concept which is called kalbon. And the Bartanura says that the word kalbon starts with a kuf and a lamed, kal, which means dover kal, something that is light, umuat, and it's very limited. It's a certain payment, but a very limited and small amount of payment. We'll see later on exactly how much money it's worth. It might even be worth 1/24th of Maktas HaShekel, a very small additional payment that's added to the Maktas HaShekel. Rashi in Masechet Bechoros on Daf Nun Vav Amud Beis tells us that according to one opinion, the reason for adding a kalbon to the Maktas HaShekel is because of a concept called hachreya. Hachreya means that you want to be absolutely sure that you gave the value of a Maktas HaShekel. There's always a little bit of a suffix that maybe when you collected smaller coins and the sum total of it was Maktas HaShekel, maybe it wasn't exactly equivalent to a Maktas HaShekel that the Torah had in mind. And then Rashi quotes another opinion that the reason for the payment of the kalbon is because of dmei chiluf. Chiluf means that the money changer has to be paid a commission. And we don't want Hegdish to suffer a loss in having to convert the money at the money changer, at the Shulchani and the Chedvani. Therefore, to offset the loss of Hegdish, you add another little payment, which is called a kalbon. And the Mishnah says, Leviim Yisraelim v'Gerim v'Avodim v'Shuchrarim, all those who are chayav in Maktas HaShekel, for example, Leviim Yisraelim Gerim and Avodim v'Shuchrarim, they have to pay an additional payment called a kalbon, avalo, but not those who are excluded from either the chiyuv of Maktas HaShekel, they're just giving it gratis, or those who are exempt from memashkinin, as we discussed yesterday. For example, Kohanim, even though they're chayav in Maktas HaShekel, but there's no din of memashkinin, we don't confiscate their possessions in order to make sure that they pay the Maktas HaShekel. They don't have that same chiyuv as Levim, Noshim v'Avodim. And in the case of Noshim, we said that although they're obligated, but nevertheless they're exempt from the law of Mimashkinin. And in the case of Avodim, they have the same exact din and status as Noshim. So since they are not included in the law of Mimashkinin, they don't have a chiyuv gomer, they don't have to pay a kalbon. Ktanim, and now we're talking about a bar mitzvah boy. He has shtei saras and shonim, but he's not yet 20 years old, and therefore he's not chayav in Maktas HaShekel. And that means that ein memashkin also. And therefore, if ein memashkin also, it's not a chiyuv gomor, and therefore they're parted from kalbon. Hashokel al yad. Now here we have to write down a translation. Al yad means bishvil, on behalf of. So somebody is offering a Maktas HaShekel out of his own pocket on behalf of a kohen, or al yad isha, or on behalf of a woman, al yad eved, on behalf of an eved, al yad katan, on behalf of katan. So he is giving from his pocket a Maktas HaShekel to the Gizbar as a payment on behalf of someone who is exempt from kalbon. And therefore, he, as the extended arm of his Mishaleach, who would not pay kalbon, doesn't pay kalbon. Now, how many was it? Since he's a bar chiyuva, he personally has to pay and contribute the Maktas HaShekel. You might think that the Maisa Shikul here is machayev him to pay kalbon. No, kamachman, he's only an extended arm of the Mishaleach, and therefore, just like the Mishaleach doesn't pay kalbon, the shliach doesn't have to add a kalbon. If, let's say, he offers a full shekel instead of a Maktas HaShekel, and with that one shekel, he wants to exempt himself and fulfill his personal obligation of machzah shekel plus his friend's machzah shekel, and again he expects to get reimbursed from his friend, is chayiv b'kalban echad. He only pays one kalban. You might think that, wait a second, in effect, he is effectuating a double payment, one on his own behalf and one on behalf of his friend. Each payment should generate its own chiyuv kalban, and he has to add two kalbanos. Kamash Malon, the Mishnah wants to tell us that, and this reflects that concept called dmei chiluf or pirut. Prita would be the better word. Prita means you pay the money changer. Here, since they got together with one seller, therefore, there's only one exchange. So the commission here would be only a single commission. That's what you'd pay the money changer, because he's taking a seller and he's splitting into two machzas hashekels. Hanosein seller, if a person gives twice a machzah shekel, he gives a larger coin, a seller which is worth 2 halves of a shekel. V'notel shekel, he therefore gets changed from the gizbar, he gets a machzah shekel back. In this case, he has to pay 2 kalbonos. And the Gemara is going to analyze why. Why is that so? So let's go back for a moment to the previous paragraph, a review of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if two people are fulfilling each one their obligation of machzah shekel with 1 shekel, then there's only one chiyuv kalbon. That's the opinion of the Tanakama. But what we omitted is the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir over shnei kolbonos. Rabbi Meir holds that each one is giving a machzah shekel, and although they're giving it together with 1 shekel, but nevertheless each one is fulfilling his obligation individually, and therefore each one is obligated in a kalma. And then the Mishnah says, "Anosein sela v'notel shekel chayav shnei kolbonos." And as I said before, the Gemara is going to analyze whether this is a reflection of the sheet of Rabbi Meir that we just saw earlier of Shnei Kolbonos. That will leave for the Gemara. The Mishnah continues, Hashokel al yad oni vayad shcheno vayad ben iro. Now is a case of a person who's not operating as a shliach on behalf of someone expecting to get reimbursed later, but rather he is taking money out of his pocket gratis. He's a good Samaritan. He wants to help out his friend, his neighbor, a destitute person, or somebody who lives in the city. Potter. We're not going to impose upon him an additional payment of kalbon because he's doing this gratis. He's not fulfilling his obligation, nor is he being sent by someone else in such a way that we can consider him a long arm of the person who's obligated to machzah. But if on the other hand, he's not giving gratis a gift on behalf of someone else, but rather he's extending a loan and he expects to get reimbursed, in that case, chayiv, he has to add a kalm. I imagine in my mind, it's just a mashal, lamad over doma. Let's say you're walking down a street where there are parking meters, and you see that there's a maid, there's a policewoman who's coming by to give tickets for those who haven't put in their quarter into the parking lot machine. You know what I mean? So you see your neighbor's car, it's about to be ticketed, so you run over and you put a quarter in the machine before she gets there. And you do it gratis. So you don't, in that case, you wouldn't have to pay a kalma. But if on the other hand, it's your neighbor and you expect to get reimbursed, you're doing him a good favor, but he has to pay you for that, then you have to pay a kalma. This is going to be a major sugya. We'll see what we can accomplish today. in a case where someone dies and he leaves a Yerusha, an inheritance, an estate, and the estate is divvied up amongst the various brothers, let's say, and then they decide to become partners again in the whole estate after they divided up the estate. So what the Mishnah is going to do now is create a contrast between two dinim. One din is the din of Kalbon, and the other din is the din of Meiser Behema. Now, Meiser Behema means that if you have in your corral, you own 10 animals that are ksherim, and you count one after the other until you get to the 10th, and that 10th is Meiser. That's based on a parsha in Bo. It says, "V'chol peter sheger behema shayir l'cha hazcharim l'Hashem." And notice that the Torah added the word l'cha. Chazal derived from the extra word l'cha v'lo shel shutvin. That if these animals are owned in partnership, then there's no chiyuv masa. The chiyuv masa behema only applies when there's one single owner. L'cha. Now, in this case, the brothers, after divvying up the estate, they went back to becoming partners. They reestablished a partnership. In such a case, they're partner from Meiser Behema because the Torah says l'cha. But on the other hand, they're chayiv in a kalma. Why? Because as we said before, shutfim are chayiv in kalma. There's no din that just because you're a shutav, you're partner from a kalma. Let's say, for example, we gave the case in the Mishnah where you gave one seller on behalf of two people. So let's say Reuven and Shimon were shutfim in that seller, and they gave that seller, which is equal to 2 machzas shekel. So both shutfim, both Reuven and Shimon, exempted themselves from machzas shekel by paying a seller together in joint partnership. They each have to add a kalma. Oh, now there's the inverse relationship. The flip side. Again, the first side was that they are chayiv in a kalmon because they shutfim, and they're partner from Meiser because shutfim are partner from Meiser. Now we have the reverse case. We have a case where they're chayiv in Meiser Sheni. They didn't divvy up the Yerusha of their father. So they're all part of one entity. There's no shutfis here. It really is almost as if the estate is in the possession of the father, the late father. And therefore, there's a chiyuv Meiser Behema. But on the other hand, there will be no chiyuv kalma because no one has private ownership. Neither one of the two brothers has yet claimed or acquired ownership because before the chalukah, the father, so to speak, I mean, he's the late father, is paying the machzas shekel on behalf of his two sons, gratis, and therefore, in a case of a gratis gift of machzas shekel, there's no kalma. Now, how much is a kalma? Kama kalma, the Mishnah records machlokas. According to Rabbi Meir, it's ma'a kesef, which is 1/12 of a machzas shekel, and according to Chacham, it's chatzi ma, it's 1/24 of a machzas shekel. 1/24, let's call it 4%. So it's a 4% tax, additional service charge that you have to add to the machzas shekel according to the Chachamim, whereas according to Rabbi Meir, it's almost 10% of the service. And all this has to do with the value of a selah vis-a-vis a ma'ah. Now, a selah, which is the shekel of the Torah, is worth 4 dinim. Every dinar is worth 6 mos. So a ma'ah is 1/24 of a selah. The Gemara says, Afal Pisha Amru, even though we've established an Ein Memashkin Noshim, Avodim Ktanim, but if they came forward to contribute to their machzas shekel, then we accept it. And it would seem from the Mishnah that Dafka, if the Ktanim gave on their own volition, their own initiative for machzas shekel, then we receive them. Holitvoa ain't tovim, but we would never demand from the Ketanim that they pay up a machzah shekel. Where's the cash? Wait a minute. We had a previous Mishnah, and Hacha in the previous Mishnah, we said that ein memashkin in es haketanim, and at Omar, the diuk, meaning the way we should read the Mishnah meticulously, the previous Mishnah, is that you don't confiscate their possessions, but tovim, they are chayev, and we could demand payment. We cannot take away their kitchen table or their couch. But Hacha here in our Mishnah, it says at Omar ein tovim. It says that we're not even going to demand from the Ketanim. We don't expect them to pay. So the answer is kan b'shevi shtei staris v'kan b'shaloevi shtei saris. When a young man reaches the age of bar mitzvah, and he's chayiv in all mitzvahs, he's chayiv likewise in machzah shekel. The Torah says in esrim shana v'mala, that's how halach in a full-fledged chiyuv, which means even memashkin. Therefore, in the case of a so-called katan, which is not really a katan, called the Torah is chayiv in all mitzvahs, it's a katan vis-a-vis mashkinin in machzah shekel, says ben esrim. In that case, he's chayav in machzah shekel. We cannot force the issue, and ein memashkin. But if he's less than 13 years old, he's not even a gadol or a bar chiyuv in other mitzvahs, then for sure he's excluded completely from the chiyuv of machzah shekel ein tov. The Mishnah continues, and this was the last thing that we did yesterday. Hanochri v'akusi sheshaklu ein mekabla mehen. And the question is, we understand a nachri, but what's a kusi? Is a kusi a nachri? Is he not a nachri? Amar Rabbi Ba Tiftar, you should interpret the Mishnah. Kimandi Amar, like Rebbe, this is the sheet of Rebbe, kusi kinachri, that the kusi has the same status of nachri. In other words, their gerus was never valid. These were people who, because of a fear of arayos, of arayos with an aleph, they decided to be misguided, but they never really sincerely accepted gerus, and therefore, according to Rebbe Shita, he understands that kusim are nachrim for all the dinim. Their gerus was never a valid, reliable gerus. And if that be the case, then they have the same exclusion as a nachri as far as machzah shekels. This palgin, but however the Chachamim disagree with Rebbe, and they maintain that kusim have a din of Yisrael, as we'll soon see in the name of Shimon Gamliel. So first we have Rebbe Shita. Rebbe Shita is akusi ke nachri. We don't recognize their gerus. Although the kusim were laid back about certain mitzvahs, but as a general rule, they identified with the Jewish people, and they were sincere in their gerus, and Rav Shimon Gamliel validates their status as Yisrael, as a ger tzedek, and therefore they're chayav in machzah. So that our Mishnah, says Rabbi Ba, reflects the shita of Rebbe. Rabbi Lazar, I don't agree with you. I think we could reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. How so? Masnis and our Mishnah ben Nachman. The Mishnah has to be read as Nachrim and omit the word kusim. Ben Nachrim ha bekusim lo. But as far as kusim are concerned, we will accept their machzah shekel. They're obligated to machzah shekel because Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds that they were gerei tzedek. Vitani, Cain. In fact, we have a brisa that quotes a drasha pasuk to indicate that kusim are obligated in machzah shekel. And the pasuk reads at the very beginning of Sefer Yikra, "V'taber b'nei Yisrael v'mart alehem adam ki akriv mikem karban Hashem." What does the word Adam come to include? Adam l'Rabbos Gerim. So therefore, Gerim are included in all the dinim of Karbanos. And then it says, Mikem lahotzi es hamumr. And a mumar means he's a mumar kolatar kula. He completely tramples the laws of the Torah. He's not careful about it at all. But kusim are not mumrim. They're not mishumadim l'kol Torah. They have their their limitations. In fact, at one point they were suspect of avodah zarah, but nevertheless they weren't completely in denial and rejection of the entire Torah, and therefore we can accept from them the machzis Hashem. So it comes out, according to Rabbi Lazar, that if you're going to omit the word kutzim from the Mishnah, then you've reconciled the Mishnah with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, because kutzim are to be omitted. They have the same status as Yisrael, the chayvim matzah shekel, because their gerus was a valid gerus. Says the Gemara, Masnisa pligi al Rabbi Lazar. The Mishnah contradicts Rabbi Lazar. I'm going to prove to you that the gerus in our Mishnah, as we have it, is correct gerus, that the word kutzim is included in the Mishnah. Why? Because it says in the Sefer, it says, Ein mekabel miyadam kinei zavim v'zavos kinei yoldos. These are karbanos that are brought in the process of purification from tumas ziva or from tumas leda. Obviously, we must be talking about kutzim. The whole parasha of Ziva in Vayikra Tesva, Bnei Yisrael. And the Gemara Nida Lamadal says, Bnei Yisrael metam b'ziva, vein ovdei kachov metam b'ziva. Same thing in regard to Yolenes. So Goyim are not shaykh to these tumah. How could they be included in the Tara process if they're not even Tmeim? What does that have to do with the Karbonis, the Kidim of his own? So there's no Hamri. The Mishnah would be redundant. Hello, we have no choice, but we have to assume that the Mishnah is addressing Kusim. Now, you just told me, Rabbi Lazar, that the narration of the Mishnah was Nachrim to the exclusion of Kusim, and the Sefer is referring to Kusim. So Gemara says, Reisha ben Nachrim, the Sefer ben Kusim. According to Rabbi Lazar, we have no choice. It's a little bit sticky, but we have to assume that the Reisha is talking about Nachrim, and with regard to Nachrim, there's no chiyuv machzas shekel. Leave out Kusim because we're going to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and Kusim have the status of Israel. And the Sefer, when it talks about Tumah, then we're addressing Kusim. Kusim, who according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel have full-fledged status as Jews, and now they're included in Tumah Ziva and included Yoledes. Nevertheless, the Mishnah tells us, Ein mekabel miyadam kinei zavim v'zavos. And the reason for that is Chazal made a takon in order to separate us from the Kutzim, so we wouldn't intermarry with them. There were a lot of psulei yuchsim there, and therefore they instituted this halach that we don't accept their karbanos, the kinim of zavim, zavos, and yoldos. And the Gemara says, Kenu, and that's the final maskana. The Gemara Reisha benachrim v'seifa b'kusim. Rabbi Yochanan. Now, at this point, the Gemara goes off on a little bit of a tangent to figure out what contributions can we accept from Nachrim and what are excluded completely. We cannot accept contributions of Nachrim. So if you'll ever serve as an officer in a shul on the board, and you all of a sudden, your Italian neighbor wants to offer you a major contribution in the building process. There's a capital fundraising campaign, and he wants to give you $1 million check. Obviously, you want to take it. I mean, with $1 million, you could build at least half the shul. Well, not. But so, what's the law? Do we accept gifts and contributions from Goyim? If we're at the stage where we're building the Beis HaMikdash, or in our time, a Beis HaKnesses, we're not going to accept any gifts, any contributions from Goyim. Lo davar mesuyam, v'lo davar she'eino mesuyam. Now the Gemara Masechet Erchin explains the difference between a davar mesuyam and a davar she'ena mesuyam. A davar mesuyam is when the guy comes to contribute a specific part of the Beis Hamikdash. For example, the Gemara says on the top of the roof of the Mikdash, they set up tavlo shel barzel amal amo in order to keep away, the birds, that the birds shouldn't land on the roof of the Mikdash, etc., etc. And there were other different specified objects which the guy wanted to contribute and have their name written. This was given by John Paul Jones. So in all these cases of a davar mesuyim, says Rabbi Yochanan, we cannot accept them because it's kari al shem nachu. It's an embarrassment to say that this menorah in the Beis Hamikdash was dedicated by a guy, or this kli sharis. That's a gnai for the Beis Hamikdash that's built by goy. And not only that, the goy take pride. They say, "Oh yeah, that menorah in the Jewish temple, I donated it." Not only that, davar she'ena mesuyam, that also we don't accept. Why? Because what's going to happen? We're going to accept the davar she'ena mesuyam, which is something that could be sold on the market, converted into liquid assets. It's not something that, like a menorah that you hang up, so it's not mesuyam. So you don't point to it and say, "Oh, he could take pride that he gave." But nevertheless, it's possible that they want to mess us up. They really are adversaries. So they offer money and they make a pledge. And then at the end, they don't even live up to that pledge. We start relying on them. And this is all an Eitzer Ra. And they're going to start playing games with us, with monies, in such a way it's going to delay the process of the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Well, Basof, says Rabbi Yochanan, once the Mikdash is up and running, and now we need, funds to take care of daily upkeep of the Mikdash. There's a crack here, and there's a hole here, and there's a drain, and there's a fly that went into the curtains, and this, that, and the other thing, holes in the curtains. That's already a different story. Then says Rabbi Yochanan, if they gave specifically for something, they want their name called on the, they fixed the crack in the Kodesh Kodashim, that we won't accept. But if they give us cash or objects that we can sell on the market and convert to liquid assets, then they're not inspired. They don't start bragging with pride. "Oh, I gave that." So that's called the davar she'ena mesuyam. Once the Mikdash is standing, Rabbi Yochanan is lenient, it allows us to accept contributions for a davar she'ena mesuyam. And Reish Lakish says, he disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan. Flat across the board. Absolute. We don't accept any contributions from Goyim for the Beis Hamikdash, even after the Mikdash is standing, and even if it's a davar she'ena mesuyam. The separate halacha, it's mama that comes from Goyim. We don't want mama that comes from Goyim. It's a kind of metaphysical halacha. We don't want their mama to have anything to do with building Kodesh. So the Gemara says, "Masnisa pliga Rabbi Yochanan." I have a brisa that explicitly contradicts Rabbi Yochanan. The brisa says, "Hey, mekabel man hegdesh unedavel lebedek habayis." And hegdesh or bedek habayis means that the Beis Hamikdash is already standing, and yet it says, "Hey, mekabel man." It doesn't differentiate. The stimas haloshen is mashma and degenerate, all inclusive. We don't accept from them, even if it's a davar she'ena mesuyam. Potar le Rabbi Yochanan. No, the Bryce is talking about bein b'tchila bein b'sofa b'vad shu davar mesuyam. When the Bryce says, "Hey, mekabel man," it's referring to both cases. While we're in the process of building the Mikdash, they want to contribute, and after the Mikdash is stood, they want to contribute. And the Mishnah and the Brisa, it uses a stama, an unqualified absolute language, because we're referring even to Tchila, even before we built the Beis, even during the time or before the time we built the Beis Hamikdash. And that includes an Eitzer, even in a davar she'ena mesuyam, as we said before. Therefore, the Mishnah, the Bryce, doesn't qualify. Rav Shem Gamliel Amar, bein b'tchilu bein b'sofei mekamelim lo davar mesuyam lo davar she'ena mesuyam. The Gemara asks, "Masnitza pligi Rav Shimon Lakish. There's a Mishnah Masechta Erchin that contradicts Rab Shimon Lakish. Because the Mishnah, after formulating a machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda in the case of Erchin with regard to Goyim, writes Hakol Shavim Shehein Nodrim V'Nidarim, that if we're not dealing with Erchin specifically, where we'll have machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, but we're dealing with Damim, it's not where the guy made a pledge of Erchi Olai, but rather Dami Olai, my Damim Olai. That's a Chiyuv Damim. And it's a neder or an adava. It's a voluntary gift, and we will accept it. And that's against Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish doesn't even allow for any scenario in which we can accept a gift from a Nachri. Now, what is the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and Erech? And again, this is not our main sugya, so I'll try to make it real fast. We're always racing against the clock here in the Daf Yomi Shia. The machlokas is the following. We'll start with the shita of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that akum nerach avalo marich. So again, if the lo marich means if the Nachri makes a statement which is a pledge of Erech, and he says Erchi Alai, or he says Erech Ploni, Erech, somebody else's Erech Alai, then according to Rabbi Meir, that's invalid. But on the other hand, Nerach, he has a certain value. So if Yisrael comes along and says Erech John Paul Jones Alai, then he has to give the value of John Paul Jones. That's the sheet of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says just the opposite. Marich, if he says vis-a-vis Yisrael Erki Alai, then he is included in Erchi. Avalo Nerach, if somebody, let's say a Jew says, I want to give the Erech of a guy, ain't no Nerach. The guy Ki'ilu has no Erech. But everybody agrees, as far as Nadarim and Nadavis are concerned, we will accept their pledges. And that's against Reish Lakish, because according to Reish Lakish, there's no possibility and scenario in which we can accept their pledges. Pasar law, so Shimon Gamliel interprets the Mishnah Erchin of Nodrim. It means that the Nachri came with a neder of an Olah. He took a pledge to bring a carbon Olah, and we're going to be makar of the Olah. Because as far as Karbanis is concerned, we assume the Nachri is sincere about it, and the Torah recognizes and validates a carbon Olah of a Nachri. So if he pledges to bring an Olah, we accept that contribution of an Olah. But with regard to monetary contributions and the like, he's completely excluded. We do not accept anything from a guy according to Reish Lakish. The Gemara has to find kasha on this last answer. Nicha, I can understand that maybe we talk about an Olah when it says Nodrim. So therefore, I could say Nodrim means Nodrim Olah. So when it says Hakol Shavim Shem Nodrim, what the Mishnah has in mind is Nodrim Olah. Ella. But when it says Nidarim, what's Nidarim? Sha'amar Yisrael Harei Olai Olah. Oh, that's already the answer. I'm sorry. But before we get to the answer of the Gemara says, how do we understand Nidarim? I mean, again, if it's Nodrim, I understand, but Nidarim Olah? So the Gemara says, Ella, you know what? I'll tell you what Nidarim means. Kisha Amar Yisrael Harei Olai Olah v'Shama Noch v'Yomer Masha Amar Zeh Olai. Ditto. In other words, he also committed himself to bring a carbon Olah, just like the Israel did so. And in that case, it's called Nidarim. And that's the word Nidarim. It's the syntax, the etymology, the meaning of the word Nidarim is that he accepted the neder, so to speak, and reiterated the neder of Israel. That's called Nidarim. And that's a valid neder, that's binding. The Gemara asks, V'eno mevi imo nesachim. Wait a second. I have a kasha on both Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, because the law is that a person who's misnadeh, if he voluntarily takes upon himself to bring a carbon, included in that nedava, whether he spells it or not explicitly or not, is nesachim. And the Gemara asks in a rhetorical question, isn't it true that if there's Mosar Nesachim, there's extra Nesachim, what do we do with it? We earmark it for clay sharis. And that's a shita of Rabbi Akiva later on in Masechet Shekalim, but in any event, Nimtza, Mevi Dover Msuya. Here's a case where we're taking the contribution. Let's say the Nesachim cost 10, and the guy brought 15. We're taking the spare, the surplus 5, and we're buying a Kli Sharis. That Kli Sharis is coming directly from the money of the guy. It's a Dover Mesuyam that even Rabbi Yochanan would say we cannot accept. So how do we accept a carbon ola of an Adava from a guy, which includes also the extra funds for Nesachim, when from those funds for Nesachim, we're going to buy a Kli Sharis? It's a Dover Mesuyam. The Gemara says, Hesiv, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Bun. And to answer this question, sometimes one good question deserves another good question. But to Ninon, the Mishnah says in the resh of that Mishnah in Archen that we quoted earlier, that according to Rabbi Meir Rachim, according to Rabbi Yehuda Marichim, which means that if the Nachri says, Erech Yisrael Ploni Olai, I'll give the value of that Jew, and I'm chayv to pay it, is, wait a minute, Archen lo levedek habayis inun? Isn't it true that the monies of Erchen are earmarked for Bedek HaBayis? That's what we do with Erchen. So now, how can we accept the Dover Mesuyam, even according to Rabbi Yochanan, it should be us? So, Hechma Diat Omar Taman, what answer are you going to give in terms of Erchen? And perhaps with that answer, we'll also answer the Nesachim. And the answer is L'Shem Shamayim U'Miskaven. Meaning his Nedava, he gave for the Hakrav al Gabi Mizbeach, whether it is for the Zevach of the Ol itself, or whether it's the Nesachim, which will be poured on the Mizbeach. That was his intention. He doesn't know that we're going to take part of his funds and divert it and earmark it for Bedek HaBayis. He doesn't know that. Oh, if that's the answer to the question of how to interpret Nerachim in the Mishnah, is Kenat Omer Afachim. We'll use the same answer here. You got to Moshe Netzachim. L'Shem Shamayim, who miskavinim aleim, turning here to the Daf of Beis, ein boim lebedek habayis. His kavan is L'Shem Shamayim, and the Nachri doesn't have to know anything about Mosar Nesachim, that he paid an extra 5, for the libations of wine, and there was a couple of shekalim that were extra there that were needed, and they went ahead and they bought a Kli Sharis. He doesn't know about that. It's in his mind. His Maisa Nesina is a Nesina of a carbon, and that we're allowed to take from him. There, it's assumed to be l'shem Shama.